Thank you for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here, going live, doing a live stream. You're welcome to join me. 339-244-3665. That number again is 339-244-3665. What is on your mind this afternoon? I have a guest coming up at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time, that being Dr. Bryant Welsh. He's a psychologist and a political activist, and the name of his book is State of Confusion: Political Manipulation and the Assault on the American Mind. And he comes to this subject as a man clearly on the left politically, which tells me that he's only getting half the story right. And I'm looking forward to a debate with him. He talks about how after 9/11, George W. Bush used manipulation. We'll get into what he means to manipulate fear in the American mind to convince us to go to war against Iraq, which had nothing to do with, according to him, the 9/11 assault. And while he may be right about that on the surface, I would argue that you could say that about America's entry into most wars. You could certainly say that about America's entry into World War I and World War II, not to mention Korea and Vietnam. Did those countries pose a direct threat to the United States? No. We were manipulated into going into those wars by a marketing campaign that ginned up our hatred and our fear so that we would, to the point where we would reach a state of frenzy, that we would be willing to have our young men in uniform go overseas and die in order to defend us, because we became convinced that we were under assault. Well, we weren't. World War I, we had no business being involved in that. There was neither side was interested in assaulting us. In fact, both sides were suing for keeping us neutral. Same thing with World War II, basically. And yet he only sees this with Bush and with Iraq. So I want to broaden the context. The other thing is, of course, is that he feels that Donald Trump uses, all those usual liberal memes, like he has something against black people and he has something against Muslims, and so he's ginning up fear in us. And he points out the Trump's statement about temporarily putting a halt to Muslim immigration into the United States, which if you put it into context, he said that right after the murderous assault in Paris, where innocent people were gunned down. And if you look at the whole thing, he said we have to have perhaps a temporary ban until we can help the Muslim world figure out how to deal with this problem. And I would argue that that's not generating fear. That is a legitimate concern, not only by this nation, but by any sovereign nation. If you have a group of people, even though it's a tiny minority, that has declared war openly against your nation, the United States in this case, and they're going out and they're just machine gunning people, then under those circumstances, it is appropriate to take prudent and reasonable measures. Now, Trump, unlike Obama, or unlike Bush for that matter, the Bushes, he wasn't sending troops over to try to shoot people. He simply was saying, let's protect the homeland briefly until we can figure out this problem. So I really honestly don't think that the left wants to translate that into meaning he's got something against Muslims. Not at all. And at the same time, of course, then Trump is viciously assaulted for being too friendly to the Saudis. Last I checked, they're Muslim. And the whole Muslim ban, the biggest Muslim nations in the world were not banned, namely Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Indonesia. It was only certain nations, both Muslim and non-Muslim, who had declared an attempt to engage in war against the United States, and who were actively doing so. There's a great deal of evidence to suggest that he simply said, we're going to ban immigration from them temporarily, not invade them. So, this whole meme from the left is preposterous. And the whole idea that he said something against black people, that's a lie. It's absolutely absurd. If anything, President Trump's policies are exposing the lie on the left, which is that their policies have hurt black people, have hurt black families, going back to the 60s, really. with their, they offer black America two things: abortion and welfare, both of which have hurt the black community spiritually and materially. They've hurt the black family. They've hurt the education of young black students with their cockamamie big, public schools with their learning modalities that create dyslexia, like look, say, reading and other things. They've hurt the black church. They've hurt black enterprise, entrepreneurialism with high taxes and onerous regulations that have kept black people from getting into business and keeping more of what they earn, just like the rest of us. So, and then to put it all, to add insult to injury, they've created this whole micro industry of aggression theory, where they put you under a microscope to see if you're racist. In a way, that's, I think, proof that racism has receded in this country, because now you have to look at someone's genes. You have to put them under and say, oh, in 1958 they said blah blah blah. You know what I mean? To prove that they're racist. And so has that helped anyone? I mean, all that's done is cover up their own malfeasance and their own genuine racism. So I disagree, to bring things back here, with Dr. Brian Welsh, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation. And let me just, and I'm prefacing this, I'm sort of prepping a little bit here for the show. So you'll have to give me a little latitude as I talk this through. Let me just say that, to give some background here, that there is maybe a psychological breakdown, and it is to a certain extent on both sides of the political spectrum, in that neither side really talks to each other anymore. And, I think that has been exacerbated, quite frankly, by the election of Donald Trump, only because Donald Trump is not just a conservative in policy, but that he means it. He actually has a vision, and he intends to implement it and fulfill it. He was elected for that. And that is what's creating such animosity and angst on the left, and such division, that, dare I suggest, I think that the country has become divided in a way that might have been similar, not literally, but perhaps at least ideologically, similar to the way the country was probably like in the decade leading up to the Civil War between the North and the South, or even in the decade leading up to the Declaration of Independence in 1776 between the Patriot movement and the Loyalists, or the Whigs. And, that is something that's happening, because one side has clearly defined who they are, and they have stepped into a position where they can and are influencing the course of the course of events. In the case of the American Revolution, it was the Patriots who were saying, we don't no longer need this distant monarch from this island across the Atlantic telling us what to do and dictating how we should live our lives. In the case of the Civil War, it was a movement by both sides, but to a certain extent the abolitionists, to say that we can no longer countenance this barbarous institution of slavery. It contradicts the American vision of itself. It's immoral for one individual to own another individual like they own a piece of property. And the sound of that got so loud that it led to the fracture. As far as the fracture now, the left, the enemies of Trump are incoherent. They don't have anything that they can articulate, because they don't believe in anything when it comes down to it. And they're afraid to be too upfront about what they do believe in, because they know that Americans would reject it. That's why Obama was so cagey. That's why the Bushes, and Clinton, and even, going back, I mean, that these people spoke in like a language, as French scholar Elaine Benescon called it, the language of totalitarianism, doublespeak, sophistry. And because they were obscuring what they actually believed in, whereas you got a guy like Trump, who is about as subtle as a broken leg, steps in and he articulates what he believes in, and he says, I'm going to do this, and he gets elected. So yeah, there's huge difference, and the other side is struggling to figure out how much they want to reveal about themselves, even to themselves. And the result is a huge fissure in this country. And I'll just give you a personal anecdote on this. Back in the late 1990s, when I first became interested in doing talk radio, I got a radio gig at Tufts University here in Greater Boston. And I went there, and I was really the only conservative to be on that campus, probably, or certainly the only conservative at that radio station. And the other people, they had blue hair and they had lots of nose rings and tattoos, and they were grungy. And there was a couple of people who didn't particularly like me, but most people were like fascinated, and they were like, great. And there was debates, and I had people on the air, and I remember we had good, vigorous, ribald discussions, and you know, it could get passionate, but we always would end up with a laugh. And also, I had a very long list of, in those years, not just at Tufts, but at other radio stations, a very prominent liberal left thinkers and intellectuals like Noam Chomsky and the late Howard Zinn and Gloria Steinem, and a long list of liberal left academics and intellectuals and authors. And, mostly we would vigorously debate, but it would end on a friendly note, mostly, not always. But, for the most part, it was a great debate. Then there was a period of about 15 years. I left Tufts. I had left Tufts, I think, in around 1998, 1999, and I came back in 2016, just before the election of Trump. And I was there for about 6 months, and the atmosphere was totally different. It was almost like Rumpelstiltskin waking up after having been in a deep sleep for 50 years and discovering a whole new world. People were not just unfriendly, but people were afraid to talk to me. There was whispers, oh, oh boy, who is this guy? And the atmosphere was cold and chilly, and liberals would not come on the air with me, including people who knew me. And it wasn't personal. It was just liberals weren't talking to conservatives, which, by the way, I'm very happy to say that Dr. Bryant Welsh is coming on with me today at 1:30, and I don't know if he knows that I'm not liberal, but either way, I mean, I admire the fact that he's doing this. So maybe there's a change. Who knows? I doubt it. It may be just true in his case. But the atmosphere was, as I said, it was really shut down. Students were not talking to me. Everybody was keeping their head low. And then I said something the day that the Muslim terrorists shot up the airport in Brussels, or did a stabbing spree in London. There was a big story that day. My show went on the air the next day, and I talked about that. And I talked about the fact that President Trump had called for a temporary ban of Muslim immigration until we could figure out this problem, and that was a moderate and reasonable thing to do under the circumstances. It wasn't anything against Muslim people. It was against this tiny minority that was at war with the United States and that had engaged in violence in Europe, where we have allies, and that we had to help them sort this thing out before we could resume normalcy. Well, anyway, someone out there was listening to the show. They took deep offense to it, and they called apparently there's this anti-bias police. It's like a Gestapo almost, that's on the Tufts University campus. And I later became aware of the fact that this is on a lot of campuses where you can report someone. You report a, snitch on a Trump supporter, basically. Anybody who says something that isn't goose stepping to the left, something that's not politically correct. And they reported me, and I ended up getting a call from the college newspaper, who did a real attack piece on me, right wing, this and that I criticized the bias police, which I did. And then they moved my show to 3 o'clock in the morning. So I didn't stay much longer after that. But the point I'm making is that it was a whole different ball game, and this is what the Trump era looks like. So I think if there's any kind of a psychological problem going on now, and if Dr. Bryant Welsh's book State of Confusion is actually a non-biased and objective look at the state of confusion, it is what I just described. The fact that the left and the right no longer speak to each other, no longer communicate, they're operating on two separate planes, and that is bad and dangerous for this country. We could take a look at how the news is reported. President Trump is absolutely right. Every day, the mainstream press goes on a absolute, unhinged diatribe against Trump to the point where they're just they're not making sense. I mean, it's every day it's a new outrage. I'll give you just the example of yesterday. All three major networks devoted a pretty big segment to the fact that Vice President Pence visited the Mayo Clinic and he did not wear a mask. Oh my God, this is such big news and so shocking. I mean, as somebody that I know who is a person of the left was weeping. Oh, this is so terrible. Anyway, there are more important things going on in the world right now. Like, for example, maybe that the North Korean dictator might be dead, in which case there's rumors that China might invade North Korea. Or, I mean, there are, the Iranians are ratcheting up war whoops against American battleships and against Israel. I mean, there's a pandemic going on. No, they have to devote all this time to this story because they got a little something, like against Trump, and they're going to ramp it up. And it's almost like a psychological trigger in the back of people's minds, like they have a computer chip or something that stimulates, and that's another moment of rage for the Trump people, the Trump haters. And that's what I'm talking about. And I think that's obvious. I mean, I talked about this yesterday. An obvious example of the left bias of the media is that they refuse to talk about Joe Biden's the accusations against him for rape and sexual harassment. That's another subject for another day. But the point I'm making here is that there is a major divide, a major split in this country, and that it could very well lead to a breakdown. If we're not going to talk to each other, if we're not going to communicate, if we're not going to engage with each other, then that is the beginnings of a potential breakdown and a potential civil war. I believe that. And, I've tried to devote my own public, broadcasting in the past, and even for this show as well, to having those debates with people who I don't agree with, and doing so with respectful dialogue and an attempt to sort of try to uncover what they do believe in and what I believe in, to let the listener then hear this and make up their own mind and incorporate their own views and not try to, I don't like shout radio. It gives me a toothache and I don't do it. But I do like to have vigorous debate. I like contrasting views. And if we're not going to have that, and we're all going to retreat into our own little cocoon and create our own literal realities, then we're all going to be in trouble as a nation. And we're also probably going to be in trouble as people, personally. So anyway, those are my thoughts as I prepare for my interview with Dr. Bryant Welsh. That'll be coming up at 1:30 this afternoon. You can see it live, or you'll see it posted on all of the sites that carry my show. His book is called State of Confusion, Political Manipulation and the Assault on the American Mind. And of course, you can check out my books. They're available at Amazon.com. You can just put my name in the server, Charles Moscowitz. That's like Moscow with a Witz. And my books will all come up, and you're welcome to check them out. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Let's stay safe. We'll talk about the pandemic another time. Suffice to say that I think we're toward the end of it at this point, but that's my opinion. I'm not a doctor. Either way, we're not there yet, so be careful. And have a great afternoon.